Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, we welcome George Firican. George is an exuberant advocate for the importance of data, a frequent conference speaker, and a YouTuber. He is the founder of lightsondata.com and co-host of the Lights on Data show. And I'll tell you, where some of the influencers out there are all style and no substance, George's content provides real insights across a bunch of different data topics, some of which we'll touch on today. So George, welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. It's awesome to have you here. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm equally excited, and thank you, Anthony, for having me on, and thank you for the kind words as well.
Of course. No, it's really, I mean, I've known of you and connected with you at various points over the past, several years, but, it feels like this is an overdue episode. Like, this is, you're a person I should have been like, you should have been first 10 people I brought onto the show. So better late than never. And I'm happy that we're able to do this, and I'm excited for the conversation. So why don't we start by, for those that are watching or listening who don't already know you, help us understand what's your story and how did you find your calling as the friendly data guy?
The friendly data guy.
The friendly data guy.
Yes. Well, so I'm a data governance practitioner by heart, but also by profession. So that's my day-to-day role and job. I practice data governance, and then I talk about it and try and impart my knowledge. But no, I didn't, start with a degree in data governance. Unfortunately, there's none yet.
Not yet.
You can embark on. Not yet. But I'm sure soon enough we'll have that bachelor in data governance and master's and even PhD. So I did start in software programming, actually. That was my initial calling. And as I started working more on the front end stuff, I really enjoyed that interaction with the customer through the business analysts, really mainly, to understand the requirements, what their challenges are, what are they trying to accomplish. So then I kind of made that switch into that project management role, more on the technical side. And that gave me even more visibility. And I think at that point, I really understood the impact that data has in all these systems and the importance really of data quality. And of course, you can't really have good data quality without data governance. That's sort of how I progressed. I actually went into a data quality managerial role, which was really just focused on that. Just give us better data for our organization on this particular system. And then I kind of learned on the job the idea that, okay, we're missing certain things here. We can't really make it sustainable without this data governance piece. And what is that? And then I really discovered a magical world of data governance. And really, it was a surprise to me when I joined the first Dataversity conference that it was such a much bigger world than I thought it was. And that so many more people were addressing the need, but also so many people were facing similar challenges than I was. And really that roped me in 10 years ago, and haven't looked back since.
That's awesome. Yeah, the conferences were so big for me as well, because for so long I just felt like I was the only one who cared about this stuff, and to go to a DGIQ or an enterprise data world and realize, hey, I'm one of many people out there that feels like they're totally alone in all this stuff. And it was awesome. And I miss that dearly in the year of pandemic. But hopefully before too long, we'll get to do it again. So
I'm sure.
One thing, because I also came from kind of a technology focused background in building software. And I have this hypothesis that, when you have that technology background, you tend to have an appreciation for some of the structures that are necessary to develop, the proper kinds of data governance that you need. Like when you code, there are, it's black and white, it's ones and zeros at the end of the day. And I think that mentality of it either works or it doesn't influences how you approach data governance. Do you think that's the case, or do you think I'm nuts? Because that could be too.
Well, and maybe I'm biased that I'm seeing it in a similar way, because I do, we share similar backgrounds, I guess, on the technical side. And yes, I completely agree with you. And then having the software development piece, I think, in the back, and understanding how the whole project methodology and development works just puts even more structure and brings that structure into the data governance world, where sometimes, because you need to work with the business and address all these different requirements, I think you do need to put that structure, that it's clear to everybody what sort of path you need to follow to get to the place where you want to be.
Yeah, and then your career progression is almost how I would kind of draw it up to some extent, because moving into project management and the kinds of structure that it takes, but from that business perspective, kind of adds another flavor to it. Because I think ultimately, like in data governance, I think we would all agree, you're connecting that business impact and that business need for data to the technology systems and platforms that help nurture and steward data in the technical context. And so having experience and capabilities on both sides naturally makes sense for a data governance professional. But that project management piece, I think, really is a strong piece because of the nature of data governance as a change function in an organization. Could you talk a little bit about your perspective on data governance as it relates to change management?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you know what? I think change management is often overlooked in data governance. I don't know if you feel that way, but I feel it's overlooked along with really the entire communication of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think IDC was mentioning at a conference lots of years ago that data governance is maybe 80% communication. And it's true. And if you don't have that change management in place, and if you are not starting to engage with the data stakeholders, with the business owners from the get-go and understand what's in it for them, if you're not finding the answer to that question and then showing how data governance will address it, how it will address their needs, their requirements, you're kind of losing half the battle. It's really hard to drive your point across and get them on board and get them to take ownership and involvement, right? And to help you create those standards and enforce the policies and monitor the quality of the data and everything that goes with it. So change management is a very, very important aspect that really overlaps with this. And regardless of what other people are saying, I mean, data governance does bring in change to an organization. And I know there's things such as a non-invasive data governance, but still it does require that change and constant interaction, involvement with the stakeholder.
No doubt. And I think, one of the things that can put a data governance effort in the wrong direction is thinking that data governance is fundamentally about the data. Because that's a one side. It's where you're operating. It's what you're like thinking about in terms of the functional influence you're trying to have. But if you don't realize, it's not about the data, it's about how the business can leverage that data and use that data to do something with it. If you don't focus on that part, you'll lose half of it, and then it makes it very difficult for data governance to be successful in the end.
Yeah, that's well said. And I mean, DEMA is defining it as the exercise of authority, control, and shared decision-making over the management of data assets, right? And the usage of data assets. So yes, maybe you're right. Maybe data governance kind of giving it not a bad name, but it's taking also the focus away from the business side of things, which is very much the focus.
Yeah, I often struggle with some of the terminology we've chosen in the broader data management space, because it's like data governance really is about change management, and if we don't understand it's helping drive more successful business through data governance is it's still correct because of what we're doing with the data. So I get it. But I get really worked up when it comes to things like metadata management. I'm like, so wait a second. We've chosen this term that just naturally confuses all normal people and just sounds like really, really difficult. And literally we're just talking about providing some context to make data more useful. Like it's such a complicated term for such a simple concept at the end.
Exactly. Yeah. Plus, there's so much overlap with all these other data management areas within data quality and even privacy and data management overall. So, plus, if you Google data, what is data governance? I think you're gonna get over 50 definitions.
Well, isn't that's so interesting too, because we can't even get clarity on the term data governance. How are we possibly going to get alignment on how you do it? Like we can't even define the term consistently. And I think as like a deeper data management professional community, I like the definition that you brought forth from Dama, like that's getting pretty close. I think we're more or less aligned on that, but we can also amplify it with all of these other terms. And so, like, help me understand the kind of the landscape of some of the core terms. So we talk about like data governance or enterprise data management or information governance or enterprise information management. We could throw some enterprise architecture into that, or data architecture. All of these terms are floating around. How in the world are we supposed to keep them straight? Especially for the folks that are just now coming into it, it's got to be overwhelming.
It is. And I think even for the data management professionals, sometimes you're like, what? Hold on. I mean, I know Tom Redmond, for example, he's saying, well, there's so much overlap on data governance and data quality in multiple ways. They're kind of the same thing. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's sort of what I gather from some of the things that he's saying.
Yeah.
And he's definitely the data quality guru out there. But yeah, I see him. I think Dama, in a way, is putting them in a right order, that they're kind of all these spokes on the wheel, all the data management areas, and then data governance kind of sits in the middle, trying to tie them all up to make sure that they work together nicely.
Yeah. And to give you a little extra plug for some of the work that you've done on YouTube, I just find that your format and the way you bring, like, you'll have a video and you'll talk about, something straightforward, like getting started with data governance, and you actually break it down. It's probably about a 14-15 minute video, and you actually break down what are we talking about here, what do you need to do to get started. And what I really found helpful is that you break it down enough to where a person can actually start doing something. And it's not so prescriptive that it's like, okay, check this box, check this box, check this box, but it gives people something really actionable for doing something. So if this world of what we're talking about, George and I on the show right now, if you're like, I really could use help understanding some of this terminology and navigating through it, check out some of George's videos, because they really do a good job of breaking down some of this in a little bit more piecemeal way than what we're going to be able to do on the show today.
Well, I appreciate it. And definitely more will come. And I appreciate the support, and seeing how it's helping people is definitely giving me the energy and motivation to keep on creating content, which, as you know, takes a bit of time to put together. It
is. We were talking before we started recording the show, and I was like, George's production quality is so good. And I'm like, as a person who spends a lot of time doing these episodes and stuff myself, I'm in awe of your ability to make that so professional, because it is no small amount of work. So George's content, excellent content, well polished, definitely worth a subscribe on YouTube. After you subscribe here on YouTube, of course, but then jump over to George's feed and subscribe there. So no, but it is really a service that you're doing for the community. Like, I mean, most of us that are doing this kind of content are really motivated by just trying to extend the conversation, realizing not everybody gets to these conferences, not everybody has the chance to take dedicated training, or like there's not even a college course or major on this stuff. And so a lot of us, I don't know about you, but we talked about the benefits of coming from like the software development side of things. I did data governance for the better part of a decade before I knew data governance was a thing.
Right.
And so helping to introduce people to that earlier is a helpful thing, I think. So definitely, it's a good to have that conversation. And I feel lucky that we have these formats, these channels that didn't exist, 15 years ago. We couldn't have seen these things if we wanted to. They weren't there.
I know. And, I appreciate hosts such as yourself that are really putting in the time to bring in all these other voices and share opinions, and at the same time give some practical advice to the audience. So thanks for putting the time into it.
Yeah, likewise. It's great to be part of that community, definitely. So let's dive into some details on what some things that people might be thinking about when we're coming from a data leadership perspective. Obviously, we've kind of touched on kind of one of the core, components of that of impacting businesses and trying to connect into things that are really meaningful for our organizations. One of the things that you talk about is managing data as a business asset, and that's pretty fundamental. Why don't we start there? When you talk about that, what are the key points to that?
So here's how I like to look at it and to compare with what other assets a company has. And the two major ones that come in mind are, well, the financial assets, which is almost everything that you can think of. And then, well, the employees as, human resources is the other assets. And well, traditionally, financial assets are, well, managed by the finance department, employees by HR. And right, so we have the employees as assets, financial assets, and then we also have data as another asset, or assets, I guess it's plural. So if we do focus on the financial assets, well, who's managing those? Kind of accountants, if you think about it. And accountants are governed by a set of principles and policies and are checked in by auditors, right? And auditing really ensures that correct management of financial assets. Basically, that there's no cooking the books, if you will. So the way I see it, principles, policies, auditing really accomplishes for financial assets what data governance accomplishes for data. Right. So in that sense, Clive Humby back in the, I think, early 90s, maybe, he was one of the Tesco club card architects. So the Tesco is kind of like the Walmart of the UK, if you will, or Target. So there's this like online, in-person and online supermarket that has a lot more than a supermarket would. And he was brought in, him and his wife actually were brought in to see how could they derive a point system for their like membership card, right? So every time you're scanning your card, you're gaining some points, and then the company, they might be able to benefit from those insights to kind of see what you're purchasing and how they could motivate you to purchase other stuff or purchase more and keep on coming back. It's something that any store wants, right? And anyways, he devised a system. So he was really a statistician, mathematician by heart, by trade, but he sort of became a data scientist, if you will, through this. And he really showed through this data is such a big asset that I'm going to call it the new oil, which is something that's debated because it's not really, data is not like oil, but in some ways it is. But what he was trying to say by coining that phrase, is that data is an asset, that data can bring a lot of value, and it can derive a lot of value by extracting that information out of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of merit, I think, in this analogy or this notion of data as an asset. Where I think it's interesting to think about how it deviates from traditional assets is that it's not consumed the same way. Like if you use data, in a lot of ways, data actually, it doesn't reduce. You don't consume it and it goes away. The more you use it, actually, the more valuable it can become because of these derivatives of data that allow you to do more with it. And so like the more you use it, the more valuable it becomes, which is an interesting dynamic that I haven't actually found a perfect analogy to. Do you have anything else that you've been able to say beyond like this, traditional asset comparison? Like the oil one is one that we've heard for a bit. I've tried to talk about it as energy, and that's basically the same thing as oil. I've tried. I just don't know.
I've heard all these other analogies, like data is the new water source or even the new plutonium. But yes, all of them still rely on the physical aspects that you can only use once, type of a thing. And you can use it for multiple pieces at the same time out of the same thing. So with a I don't know, a table in a database, you can have multiple uses in parallel and draw different types of information and benefits out of it.
Yeah, and maybe we're better off that there isn't an analogy, because it's kind of great that you can think, hey, what other scenario can you use it as much as you want, and the more you use it, it becomes more valuable. And
Mm-hmm.
why are we so bad at this still? Like how is it that we've just been like, nah, we're not going to put enough energy into to doing this thing, which is basically infinite in its potential for us. And most organizations are still, woefully inept at capitalizing on that. And it's fascinating.
And that's the thing. I mean, so many organizations are mentioning we want to be data driven, but then they're not really investing the resources into it,
Mhm.
right? Or even some that are not prioritizing different things. They're kind of really focusing on the sexy part of it. So that's the AI, machine learning applications. But then they're not investing in that infrastructure and making sure that, well, clean data is feeding these systems, which is many times why they also fail to come to good fruition.
I'm glad you brought up this whole notion of data driven, organizations that don't actually become data driven, because it's it's not it's as if they say data driven, but what they actually try to do is be like data justified. Like they do what they're going to do anyway, and then they find data to
Wow.
try to
Yeah.
validate that what they did was correct. And that is really backwards. That is not that's not what data driven is actually about. And so I think that and that's the challenge, right? It's like you have to, if you want to become more quantified, if you really want to become more data driven, you have to be okay with a few core things. You have to have first the skills to actually objectively analyze the data and take action whatever the data tells you. And you can overlay subjectivity or strategy or what have you. You don't have to do everything just based on what the machine spits out, but you
Hmm.
really do need to listen to it. And then the
Hmm.
other thing implied with that is that you have to start becoming okay with changing behavior and acknowledging and even embracing imperfections and mistakes, because data will expose those. And if you don't have, like, I read a lot about like psychological safety and building high performing teams and things like that. Same thing at an organizational level with data. If you cannot be okay by seeing imperfections that data exposes, you're going to have a whole lot of trouble becoming data driven. What are your thoughts on that, and what kind of experience have you seen that out in the wild with?
Yeah. So back to your initial point, I completely agree with that. I couldn't have said it better myself. That sometimes management is kind of looking for data as a data driven piece to supplement their decision making or to reinforce what they've already decided on. And like you said, that's a little bit backwards. And yes, on the other piece, I completely agree with you. And what I think it's hard is why there's that lack of trust.
Mhm.
I think it is because these foundations are not treated, or they don't get the resources that they need to. They're not investing highly enough in data quality and the whole data management, in master data management, and data governance, and they're investing more into, again, the data science piece or even the reporting. But once they do, if they get that wrong answer that they're not expecting or they're unhappy with, or they actually uncover, well, it's because of bad data, it just ruins everything for them. And they're like, well, we clearly can't trust it.
Mhm.
Let's go back to how we were doing things before.
Mhm.
And the issue is, well, it's a long-term investment when you're investing in these sources. So you're not going to see the ROI the next day as you would if you maybe hire another salesperson,
Right.
right? But in the long term, it will actually serve you a lot better. So that's always a challenge on how do we communicate that to the business leaders? How do we convince them of this importance? And Scott Taylor is addressing this often and also in his book, and the fact that maybe we shouldn't talk to them about the data piece, but really, again, what's in it for them, and what talk to them about the business language and what they're trying to address. And then, okay, if we are on the same page, let me invest or give me resources to invest in data governance, in data management, in data quality, and everything else that's needed to get to where you want to get to.
You just made an excellent point that I want to emphasize, and that is around we just my previous point was around being data driven or data justified, and creating this ability to be imperfect. Well, you then, if I heard you correctly, and I think I did, we also need to learn how to do that with the data itself. Like the data quality, we run a risk if we say, okay, well, we can be imperfect, but the data better be perfect. And we're going to set the expectation that the data is perfect. And then the moment that the data is not perfect, because everybody, it's not going to be perfect. The moment that happens, everybody stops trusting the data and goes back to where it was comfortable and not data driven at all.
Yeah.
And not challenging. And that's a huge risk. I think that's an enormously important point, because that is the connection point to all of those fundamental pieces, like the data qualities and the metadata management, the data governance, all of those pieces that contribute to truly becoming data driven. Data driven is what we want. Nobody wants data governance. Like even the compliance people are like, yeah, we got to do data governance. We get it. Nobody really wants that, but we know we need that to get the thing that's really important, which is being data driven, which leads us to improving our organizations, which is the top line reason to do all of this stuff. So I think excellent connection, because I don't know that that's immediately obvious and clear, because we break it down too much and then we kind of lose the forest through the trees when we start talking about data governance or data quality or what have you. So great insight that I think is hopefully very useful to some of the folks that are watching, listening out there right now. So I want to switch gears, because one other thing is, there's a role for technology in all of this. And I'm sure, as I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen as well, there's a tendency for these organizations to say, you know what, we're hearing you, data driven, data quality, yes, governance, all important. There's tools out there that just do that for us.
Sure.
What's wrong with that? Or is that okay?
Listen, I've seen cases where companies have invested just $50,000 in one license, and only one license for one tool. And that's, at a minimum. There's companies that invest a lot more. And then they're kind of expecting, well, the tool will solve everything for me. And it's not just in data governance, but really in other business areas, I find. And then they're disappointed, and that tool kind of sits on the shelf not being used for at least a year until they get their ducks in a row, because they really come to the realization, well, if we actually don't have those standards defined, if we don't have those business processes cleared out and understood, then we can't really configure the tool to help us do the work. And that's where I think the bulk of the work lies, in setting all these things. And you can do that, with a pen and paper to start. Well, I wouldn't advise it, but my point is, you need to define those things first. You need to define those policies, those standards, those procedures, understand who the players are, because in the end, the tool will just configure what you're inputting it to do. And then it also needs to know, well, who's going to use it. Even if you have some cool AI stuff that has some automation in place, all of that, it really is configured on the inputs that you're providing it.
Yeah, and so this will naturally lead into kind of the next area of conversation, because let's assume, and for simplicity's sake, that you even find this perfect technology tool and you're able to feed it all the perfect data, which we know is not really going to happen. But even if we were able to check all those boxes, do an excellent rollout, have all the licenses, get it in people's hands and what have you, at the end of the day, it only accomplishes so much if we don't actually change people's behavior and start to transform how the individual, how the human involved in all of this works and leverages that data. What kind of advice do you have around that kind of cultural change aspect in creating more data-driven organizations?
I love it how we're bringing back to the importance of change management, because yes, that is, I think, at the core. So I think we need to get people getting involved from the start. Whenever we are including a new tool, a new piece of software to be used, more often I see it that it's one group of people that are doing the evaluation, and they're doing the deployment and then training, but it's all after the fact that everybody else gets involved. And I feel that if they were involved and kind of had a say and also feed into their requirements and needs and pain points, and they're really part of the journey the whole way, they're more likely to adopt and to see how they could involve this new piece of software or tool in their processes.
Right, right. And so are there specific techniques to chip away at that? Because that feels very big. Like, I get it logically, but if I say, okay, I'm done listening to the podcast, I need to make our organization a little bit closer to this goal soon. Where do you begin with something like that?
I think a top-down approach works the best, but it can obviously be a mix as well, bottom up. What I'm saying is it's hard if you don't get that support from upper management. If they don't want to address this and have this as part of their communications, part of their message, part of their drive to showcase their employees, their colleagues, how this will create some benefit, not necessarily a change, but really some benefit to their day-to-day tasks, right? It's uh, it's all about creating that business case and bringing people on board, which is not easy overall. So I mean, there's all these change management frameworks, the ADKAR model being one of the most famous ones, which are addressing all these different pain points and how you should address people, how you should start engage with them. And I'm not an expert of it at it, but yeah, I would start there with something that's already been proven as a framework that works regardless of the industry and the field.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to ask you, I if you've listened to the show, I sometimes ask tricky or unfair questions that I really, really wish I had had the foresight to prep the guest on, but we're going to see where this one goes. So obviously you have, created a YouTube channel, you're getting subscribers, you're getting, a presence out there and getting people's attention about these topics. I'm curious if you have advice, because I get the top down, it's great to have executive support and sponsorship. What if you're sitting in an organization today where the executive team doesn't quite get it? How can I get their attention? How can I help them understand that I have the answer? I just need them to focus for a minute to understand the importance of all of this. What can we do? What can we do to get that attention?
So I'll share with you something that I've done. And that's, first of all, to understand what other pain points are out there. So what other people are being affected by a similar thing that I'm seeing, that it's affecting me, and I want to create that change in my work initially, right? So it's self-serving at first, but then you want to find out your tribe, really, because you're not the only one within the organization that's facing those challenges. Right. So you want to really find your champions, if you will. And in finding those champions, sometimes you kind of have to do things on the side of your desk to prove a point. You do have to put in that extra work to do it on the side, because you don't have the extra resources, you don't have that sponsorship in place. It's something that you're being told, no, it's not important, or you don't even have their ear to let them know that you want to do this, right? So yeah, I think it's what I've done is start to do something on the side, show that it works, start involving other people, build in those champions, so then as a group you can start voicing that need, or even prove how, even though you had no resources, you've done this little thing that had a big impact. Can we scale it up? And can we scale it up by having more resources? And then can we invest in these things? So that's one bottom up approach that I would recommend to, just find out what other pain points are out there, what other people are being affected by the same pain points, get the champions out of them. Ideally, one of these champions, we kind of have the more of direct path to upper management that he can feed into.
Excellent.
So that's one way of going about it.
So now I want to flip it around, and I want to say, because I often remark, I'm like, a lot of the major change initiatives in organizations start from when an executive gets worked up about something, and it can come from reading in a magazine, going to a conference, having a conversation with a peer. Who knows where they get the ideas, right? But if you're in we've both had opportunities to lead strategically top-down initiatives. If you're an executive and you're listening to this show, because this is the Data Leadership Podcast, and there's a lot of people that are leaders that are trying to figure out how do I use data better, right? And so if I want to create this organizational competency around data and include the data governance, include the data quality, and start to spin up these capabilities which will evolve us to a truly data-driven organizational state, how do I do that? And the first question that I would ask is, where do I put that in my organizational structure? Is this an IT type of initiative? Is this out of the CFO office I've seen? Is this an operating thing? Like, if you're the CEO, say, where does it go? Where do we structure it and branch out from it?
Yeah, and it really depends again on the industry. So there are so many different types of frameworks. I would say it definitely needs to live under C-level positions, ideally. So if you're the CEO, why don't you just have it under your track? That's not a bad idea. Or you can create a CDO type of a role that is just focused on that. Like you mentioned, I've seen it under a CFO as well. It's not always amazing, just because they have they always want it tied down to the income and the revenue out of it, and which is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes the direction of it can go, okay. It really depends on the industry that you're in. Sometimes it can work well, sometimes not so much. But I would create it under a C-level position. If you have a board, an executive board, you can have it under that, and then start creating this, what's called a data governance council committee. I've seen it as a data enablement team. So it has different names, but the whole idea is that you have all these business stakeholders that are high level, usually at a VP level. So you have representation from all the different business areas of your business, and just start to put a plan together and see where should the company focus its efforts, because you can't focus it on everything. Have the business prioritize what the minimal viable product, if you will, should be for that first year, where investment should be made, and then understand who are those main data stakeholders that you need to involve, and start there. And I know this is very, very high level.
Yeah, it is, but I think it's useful. And I think that description too helps feed in the answer to some of our folks that are listening, that are working from kind of the bottom up. And if the CEO says, hey, where should we put this? Now we understand, like, this is how that CEO might want to think about that. And so that helps us, if we're not sitting in the CEO seat, because that, quite frankly, that doesn't happen as often as somebody else in senior leadership saying, okay, we know we have this need and this is going to be the answer around data. At least now we know this is kind of how, some of the decision framework to do it. And you don't provide necessarily the answer, because it is nuanced, it is varied. And then you can think about it we can think about it logically at a high level and say, okay, given this would be the case. But then we also have to think about our specific organization's ability to execute on that. Where can we be successful in this particular organization doing this kind of work? And where are those unique challenges that are existent only in our organization, with either the people or the business that we're in, or the availability of resources. I've worked for some organizations where it was super easy to get software, really difficult to get hardware. I've seen places where you couldn't buy software or hardware, but you could get consultants all the time. And so it's like, it just depends on the unique nature of your organizational culture and where resources exist, where talents and skills are abundant, where they're scarce. How do you kind of work around some of those things? So it is important in recognizing, and George, you mentioned that there's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of tools out there to find more information, and it will be overwhelming. There's so many possible answers out there. To some extent, oftentimes, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed with options, is I often come back to some basic leadership principles and things like, I've worked in organizations where they would have a reorganization. They would reorg the business every 6 months. Well, popular analysis is that it takes 18 months for any reorg to actually take hold. So these guys were never giving it a chance and were immediately changing it. Sometimes more consistency is better than trying to find the perfect answer. Has that been your experience as well? Or do you feel like it's more important to do a lot of work up front? And then, like, how do you know? Actually, the better question is, how do you know when to put that foot forward and stop analyzing the option set and start acting on it versus, like, how do you know when that time is right?
That's why I like the more agile approach, which I find it's starting to find its way in data governance as well. And that's to focus on some very high level stuff, not define them to the T, but then as you're going and starting to exercise these things, put them into practice, you're kind of still learning and you're still finding gaps, and you're really adapting it as you go along. So I find this is maybe a little bit different than the traditional sense where we're putting all that legwork before, or all the analysis before, and then we're implementing it, and then we're putting into practice. And sometimes it's more hard to have a change after the fact. Whereas if you're setting that expectation, let's address it as we go, might also work better. But again, it's all dependent on the industry and whatever the driver of data governance is. If it's something like a regulatory compliance, then the agile way doesn't work as much either.
Yeah, I am a big advocate of that. And a lot of organizations are less comfortable with some of the ambiguity that's sort of necessary in agile, because you're finding your way based on the information that you're getting, and so you don't necessarily have as long of a plan in front of you because you just don't have enough inputs yet. And so it doesn't. My argument though is when we try to plan out too far, even in very hierarchical organizations, we still don't have that information, and so those just tend to be well planned but just as wrong as not having one. And so it's again, tweaking the specifics are a challenge for any organization.
And I feel that nowadays more than ever, really, everything is changing at a much more rapid pace. So we're getting all these external influences and needs that seem to be coming in quicker than they did before. Whereas before we could have our 5-year plan. Now we do, maybe, but because more it's ingrained in us to do it. But I feel it's not as relevant. I mean, even revisiting it 1 year after, you can see you would do a lot of changes to your initial 5-year plan.
Yeah, no, it's being nimble is so important. From the early days to the late days of being data driven. I mean, nimble is synonymous with being data driven, I think. So we only have another minute or two left. I feel like I've jumped around a bit today. Is there any areas that you'd like to cover or re-emphasize before we close out?
Well, Anthony, I mean, there's so many things. I think everything really is based on data, even though you're not considering yourself a data organization, you have a data component to it. There's no denying it. So I think we all need to invest in treating data as an asset.
Yeah, I think that's wise. And the more you think about that, the depth of that is just unending. It's not about being business and data. It's that your business is data. It is intertwined, and to be successful with business now means being successful with data. It's one and the same.
Absolutely.
Well, George, it was awesome to have the conversation with you and have you on the show today. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching or listening today. In the show notes, you'll find useful links and more information about today's topic. Follow Data Leadership Lessons on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Check out my book at dataleadershipbook.com and use promo code ALGMANDL at the Dataversity Training Center for 20% off your first purchase. Stay safe during these unusual times and go make an impact.